Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. Going to take a second here. I'm not sure we're streaming properly on all of our platforms, so I'm going to check real quick here. I'm not sure I'm on the Otterbein channel correctly. What's going on here? Yes, I am. Okay, we're good. All right, so welcome. Please say hi if you're if you're willing to tell us where you're watching from this evening. We'd love to know. Tonight, we're moving forward into the last lesson that we're going to have about wisdom. Good evening, Mike and Kim. Tonight, we're talking about the book of Job, and our title is Bad Things Happen. I almost put bad things happen to good people, but I thought it was even more important just to say that bad things happen. So, we're doing a survey of the Bible, one story at a time, and we're not using a translation or even a paraphrasing. Tonight basically is a summary of the book of Job. And it's a pretty good sized book, so it's quite condensed. And there's a lot missing. I hope you all understand that. I put the chapters in there to give you an idea of how much skipping, or the chapter numbers are in there to give you an idea of how much skipping around we are actually doing. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the text that I sent you, that'll give you an idea. And if you're not on the email list, by all means, shoot me an email to the address on your screen, and I will be sure you start getting that. Hello, Stella. Good to have you here tonight. So we're going to go ahead and get started with a word of prayer, and then we will dig into the book of Job. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I've got a lot to talk about tonight, one of which is my ring light, which is continuing to be on the blink. Good evening, Charles. Good to have you here. We've got a lot to talk about tonight. I hope doesn't seem too rushed. I really want to get home in time to watch the debate. I don't know why I want to watch the debate. I don't like anybody in it. Maybe I shouldn't have said that out loud. I was talking to the Rabbi Perman today, and yeah, well, we'll leave that out of it. I think we're on the same page. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, Roseanne. All right, so Job. I'm not going to read the chapter numbers. Those are in the if you have the text that I sent you, the chapter numbers are stuck in there, but I'm not going to bother with that right now. Oh, here we go again. We've got buffering problems because for some reason, OneDrive loves to verify right in the middle of our stream every week. Happened last week too. All right. Here we go. Book of Job. Once upon a time in the land of Uz, there was a man named Job. He was a good man who loved God and did nothing wrong, never did anything wrong. He was very rich and had 10 children. One day, all of the angels assembled at the heavenly court, and Satan the accuser was there. The Lord asked him what he'd been up to. Satan answered, I've been wandering the earth. The Lord asked Satan, what do you think about Job? There's no one else like him. He respects me and never does anything wrong. Satan replied, of course he respects you. You've given him everything he's ever wanted. Try taking it all away and see what happens. He'll curse you to your face. The Lord said, we'll see about that. Go ahead. Take it all away. The next day, Job received word that all of his wealth had been stolen and that all 10 of his children had died in a building collapse. He tore his clothes, shaved his head, and grieved, but he didn't curse God. The next time the angels assembled in the heavenly court, the Lord said to Satan, what do you think about Job? I let you ruin his life for no reason, but he's still a good man. And Satan said, he still has his health. But take that away, he will turn on you. The Lord replied, go ahead, take his health, but not his life. The next day, Job had sores break out all over his body. He couldn't stop scratching them, and his wife said, "Why do you still respect God? Curse him and die." And Job responded, "Don't be a fool. God sends both good and bad. How can we accept one without the other?" Job never cursed God. Then Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, arrived. They'd heard about all the terrible things that had happened, and they wanted to comfort him. But they barely recognized him. For the first 7 days of their visit, they all sat in silence. Finally, Job started speaking. He cursed the day of his birth, and he wished he'd never been born. Eliphaz said, "I have to respond to that. How many times have you helped other people when they were having trouble? You've always known what to say, but now that the shoe is on the other foot, you can't handle it. You, of all people, should know that people get what they deserve. Nothing like this has ever happened to an innocent person. Be glad that God is correcting you." And Job replied, "I'm sure you guys know everything. What will the world do when you're gone? Do you think I haven't thought about these things? I'm just as smart as you are." Eliphaz replied, "A wise person would never talk like this. You're full of hot air. The way you're talking proves that you're a sinner." Job said, "You guys are doing a great job at comforting me. If I were in your shoes, I could say things like that, but I wouldn't. I would try to encourage you and make you feel better." And Bildad said, "How long are you going to go on like this? Be reasonable. Then we can have a rational conversation." Job replied, "How long are you guys going to keep tormenting me like this? Even if I am a sinner, that's none of your business. I've never done anything to any of you to justify the way you're treating me. I'm telling you that I haven't done anything wrong. I don't deserve this. God is treating me unfairly." And Zophar said, "This is really starting to bother me. You have no right to get angry with us for speaking the truth. Wicked people suffer." Finally, Job uttered an oath of clearance. He said to God, "If I have committed any sins to deserve this punishment, prove it." And then the Lord answered Job. He said, "Who do you think you are? You talk a lot for someone who knows so little. I will ask the questions here. Be a man. Were you there when I created the earth? Do you understand how it works? Explain it to me. Show me where I made a mistake." And Job replied, "I spoke out of turn. I have nothing else to say." The Lord said, "Do you think you could defend yourself by condemning me?" And Job replied, "I spoke of things I did not understand, things too great for me to comprehend. Now that I have seen you with my own eyes, I will repent." The Lord then turned and addressed Job's friends, and he said, "I'm furious with you. Job has been telling the truth the whole time. You have not. You've told lies about me. Now, you need to repent and offer sacrifices to me, and your friend Job will ask me to forgive you. And I will, instead of giving you what you deserve." Job did pray for his friends, and then the Lord blessed him. Job grew wealthy again and had more children. The second half of his life was better than the first. He lived to a ripe old age and got to know his great grandchildren. He died happy. This is the word of the Lord. I've had some people chime in. Stella Roseanne says she's glad to be here. Jeff Long says good evening to everybody. Debbie Klein says good evening. Welcome, everyone. So, what to say about the book of Job? So much to say. We'll just touch the surface tonight. So, I grouped this with the wisdom literature because it's part of the evolution of this notion. Remember, we started with Proverbs, and all the Proverbs say one way or another, the righteous prosper and the wicked perish. But then we said, yeah, well, we say that to children because we want them to do the right thing, but that's not actually how the world always works. So then we got into Ecclesiastes, where Solomon is looking back over his life and he said, well, I've seen wicked people prosper and I've seen righteous people perish. And in fact, sometimes the righteous perish specifically because they're righteous people. Excuse me. Get me a new ring light. So it's not the case that the righteous prosper and the wicked perish. He said, although, and Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, he says, I will say that it's better to be righteous and it's worse to be foolish. And he seems to believe that although being righteous does not guarantee you will prosper, it will improve your odds of prospering. And being foolish can really increase the odds that you will suffer. It won't necessarily guarantee it. So then we go to this week, which is the book of Job, which is written later still. And it's really pushing back on this notion that justice is served on this earth. Now let's talk about the book itself. I'm told that Job is hard to translate. I'm not a translator. I never took Hebrew in seminary. I took Greek and did miserably at it and don't remember any of it. So, but I'm told that Job is very difficult to translate, largely because there are many words in Job that they're not sure what they mean, and they don't appear anywhere else in Hebrew literature. You know, if you're not sure what a word means, you look to see how it's used in other contexts, and it's never used anywhere in any other context. It's hard to know exactly what that word means. So that being said, the different translations of Job are pretty close. The Uz, and this is controversial in some wings of the church, but this probably is not a real place. The land of Uz literally means land of advice or land of counsel, which fits very well with the topic. Job lives in a place where he's blessed to get lots of advice, unsolicited from many people. So Job is best understood as a framing story for a conversation about why bad things happen to good people. And, you know, it's a hypothetical story because it tells us in the beginning that Job has never repented. That Job has never sinned. Now, at the end, Job repents, but then God seems to come back around and say, well, thanks, but you were right all along. You never did anything wrong. So it's a conversation about a hypothetical situation, and the conversation was created by people who are struggling with this question. All right, well, then what is the deal with wisdom, and what is the deal with justice? If people do the right thing, are they going to prosper, or why are there people who appear to be righteous who nonetheless are suffering? Now, the book is mostly poetry. I don't write poetry, so the summary that I gave you is not written in verse. The huge majority of the book is written in verse. The only parts that are not are the very beginning and the very end. And the general consensus, or at least the consensus that I buy into, I should remind you of this. I said this, but it's been a few years since I said it. Whenever you see in a study Bible in the footnote that scholars generally agree that, what they really mean is the scholars that I like generally agree that, because there's very often two schools of thought, and I belong to one. Okay, and in that school of thought, scholars generally agree that the poetry is much older than the text at the beginning and the end. Okay, so the setup where it describes Job and his children, and then it talks about God and the heavenly council and Satan making this bet, so to speak, that was added on as a way to frame the conversation, to make it more narrative. See, without that, it's just a conversation in poetry, which in poetry is great, but people wanted to frame it out. And and the books of the Bible, the books of the Old Testament reached their current form during the Babylonian exile. There were many different forms prior to, but we don't need to go into all that right now. So the poetry itself, the conversation, the things that Job says to his three friends, the things they say to him. There's a fifth character named Elihu that I didn't include because he really doesn't have anything new to add to the conversation. And some people think he was added at a third point in time because it says Job is there and it says his three friends came and they start talking to him. Then all of a sudden Elihu starts speaking. It never says that Elihu showed up. So where did Elihu come from? And some people think he's supposed to be the comic relief because he's the younger guy that showed up and started talking out of his hat. But at any rate, the book is mostly poetry, and the book does not tell us why bad things happen to good people. We should get that out of the way right now. The most important thing it does is to affirm that bad things do in fact happen to good people. See, that was open to debate. The question is, okay, well, this person is suffering. We thought he was good, but maybe he wasn't really good. Maybe he had all these hidden sins that we don't know about. Is this tragedy that is falling on him? Is this God's divine judgment upon this person? Should we assume that? Should he assume that? Should he be asking what he did wrong to deserve the punishment that he's getting? This is the first time scriptures affirm that no, we should not assume that he did something to deserve this. And it also, by extension, it shows us that the modern proverb, everything happens for a reason, simply isn't true. Or at least it isn't true in the sense that most people mean it. Most people, when they say everything happens for a reason, they mean this is part of God's plan. Okay. Now, John Wesley, the joke is, would have said, yes, everything happens for a reason, but sometimes the reason is you're an idiot. Or sometimes, in other words, this didn't happen because God decreed it so. It happened because we interfered and God's decree didn't happen, right? So everything happens for a reason, in that there's a law of causation, right? And there's always something triggering something else, but that doesn't mean that there was an intentionality behind it. And reason meaning, rational reason. Now, everything does not happen for a reason. The world is a broken place. God's will does not always prevail. We're told in the kingdom of God, in the fullness of time, it will prevail, but that's not the world that we live in right now. So the conversation, all the poetry is about that. And then you've got this framing story, which is an early use, maybe the earliest use of this word Satan, or Hasatan, as I'm told it's pronounced in Hebrew. Once again, I don't speak Hebrew, so I might have butchered that. So the word Satan means the accuser. So when I call him Satan the accuser, I'm basically pairing the English translation of the word Satan. And it serves, and in this story, Satan appears to be a member of the heavenly court. So he's, one of the nobles in heaven, and his job seems to be quality control. He's like Inspector Number 12 or whatever. I don't know if you remember the old Fruit of the Loom commercials, but he's a quality control guy on the assembly line, and he goes around testing people to see if they're up to snuff. This is written long before Revelation, which is part of the apocalyptic genre, and in apocalyptic literature, at least some of it, Satan is the new name for a former angel named Lucifer. That story had not been written yet. This is way before that. All right, so don't picture in your mind Satan the way we envision him. This is the first step in a new area of theology, which is the problem of evil. Okay, this is the first book in the Bible that says, you know what? Maybe everything, since the world is a broken place, and since God's plan was thwarted by the snake, which also the snake was just the snake. At that time in the Bible, it was not referred to as anything other than a talking snake. Revelation refers to the New Testament refers to the snake as the devil, but the Old Testament does not. So this is just the beginning of the question. Well, the things that aren't a part of God's plan, how should we talk about those things? What are they? Because prior to this, like Job said, God sends the sun and the rain. He sends the good and the bad. The assumption was whatever has come, it has come from God. And Therefore, there is a reason behind it. Um, well, Job's questioning that. At first, he affirms it. Well, take it back. He always affirms it. That's why Job has a problem. Job believes that people do get what they deserve. He's not actually questioning whether or not people get what they deserve. What he's saying is that there has been a mistake. He says, I know that people are supposed to get what they deserve. I know that that's how the world generally works, but I don't deserve this. So there has been a mistake. So I need to just talk to the right person. Like he's stuck in phone mail. I need to talk to the right person. Who do I need to talk to explain that there's been some terrible mistake? I'm being punished for somebody else's sins or something, but I know I didn't do anything. So, I wonder if I try to reach God, if I argue my case before God, if I want to argue my case before God, will God show up? Will God listen? What will happen? That's what Job wants to happen. So he believes that the righteous prosper, and he believes the wicked perish, but nonetheless he is righteous and he is perishing. Therefore, there's been an error. He's been punished for a crime he didn't commit, so he needs to appeal his case, basically. Okay. So his friends arrive, and they are helpful for the first week because they don't say anything for the first week. And my Old Testament professor, Dr. Birch, said that's a pastoral hint. When you're around people who are suffering, if you don't know what to say, don't say anything. We'll say more about that later. But then Job starts talking, and when he says that his suffering is undeserved, they start talking, and they make everything much worse because they're no longer trying to comfort Job. They said that's why they came, but that's not what they do. Maybe they think they're trying to comfort him. At any rate, they're doing something that we still do today. What they're actually doing is they're expressing their own discomfort with the situation, and they're defending their worldview. Okay. They don't want to live in a world where bad things happen to good people. Therefore, they need Job to admit that he's a bad person. And then their world makes sense again, and they can go home and they can sleep at night. Otherwise, they have to go home and think about, well, what happens then if that isn't the case? Maybe the world isn't as secure as I thought it was. So they try to explain to him for his own good that he must deserve this thing that is happening to him. And then they get angry when he is not adequately humbled by their so-called help. So eventually, and I'm summarizing huge chunks of scripture here, huge poetry, huge chunks of poetry. Job eventually issues an oath of clearance, which is a technical term it's a legal term, really, from the ancient world. And what the use of an oath of clearance was, let's say somebody's car got stolen and everybody thinks I did it. That's the word on the street. People are talking. So in the ancient world, what you would do is you would go to the gates of the city or the town, and you would make your oath in front of the town elders and say, look, everybody's saying that I stole this guy's car. I did not steal his car. If anybody has evidence to the contrary, speak now or forever hold your peace. And if anybody, well, you would take two witnesses to be admissible. If two people were to stand up and say, well, we both saw you do it, so we know you're lying. Oh, okay. Well, now, okay, you lose. You're found guilty. You have to make restitution. If one person said they'd seen it, that wouldn't have been considered valid evidence. If there was physical evidence that it was you who did it, people bring it up. But if nobody had anything to say, if nobody had any evidence at all, then you are vindicated. And nobody can ever bring this up again. It's a settled matter. Okay. So what Job is doing is he's uttering an oath of clearance. The thing is, he doesn't know what he's been convicted of. So he lists everything that he knows he didn't do, everything that could have been considered the kind of offense that would bring a punishment like this. He says, I didn't do any of these things. So it goes on for 3 chapters. It's long. He lists everything he can think of that might have gotten him in trouble, except that he didn't do it. right? And at the end of his oath of clearance, God does appear. That's what Job wanted to know at the beginning. If I demand my day in court, will God show up? And yes, in fact, God shows up. Having God show up and speak to you is a pretty big deal. Okay. And when God arrives, he offers no evidence that Job has ever done anything wrong. Therefore, Job is exonerated. Instead of entering new evidence, what does God do? God utters his own oath of clearance. He says, Job, you have made an accusation against me. You have claimed that I am acting unfairly and that I am punishing you for something that you didn't do. And I'm here today to say that I didn't. I am not treating you unfairly. I am not punishing you for any sins that you did not commit. And did you really think that you could exonerate yourself by making accusations against me? And then and Job offers no evidence to the contrary. So God's oath of clearance stands. So Job has said, I'm innocent. And he was correct. His innocence stands. God says that he is innocent. And Job offers no argument. Therefore, God's argument stands. Now you'll see that in these aspects, the poetry don't exactly line up with the framing story. Okay, the framing story is helpful for preaching purposes. Okay, but Job doesn't seem to be exactly the same person in the text that he in the verse that he is in the prose, and more importantly, God doesn't seem to be exactly the same person in the verse as he is in the prose. So then God has some choice words for Job's so-called friends. Now, a lot of people have trouble with the epilogue, and I understand why. It's the idea that Job has been made whole again when God gives him new children. And ask anybody about that who's been through it, and they will have some strong words to say about the topic. And my Old Testament professor, and he used this lecture many times, he lost a kid, and then he had more kids, and he said, new kids do not replace the ones you lost. And people are rightly offended by the interpretation of the narrator that they do. He talked about how when he was at it, and the kid they lost died young, and he was at the funeral, and he said well-meaning people came up to him and said, well, you can always have more children. To say that wasn't comforting to him in his grief that's a dramatic understatement. Last thing you ever want to say to somebody who's lost a kid. And I'm not going to challenge the idea that new kids do not replace old kids. I know new kids do not replace lost kids. Right? I am going to say that I've seen people get stuck in their grief, and in particular, when they have lost a kid. Untimely deaths in general, whether it's a sibling or a young kid losing a young parent, people sometimes get stuck in grief. The grief doesn't resolve the way it's not that grief ever goes away, but you're supposed to reach a level of acceptance where life goes on, and you have a new sense of normal. But some people don't do that. They get stuck. And in particular, they sometimes get stuck if they've lost a kid, particularly if they've lost a kid young, because there's this, and I've seen this in other types of grief too, but it's really common in this type of grief. There's this notion that if I ever experience joy again, that would be a betrayal of the memory of this person that I've lost. If I truly loved this person, then I shouldn't be happy again after having lost them. And that's sad, and it's untrue for many reasons. First of all, I don't think the person who you lost would want you to feel that way, but It's especially problematic if you have other kids. I have known people who grew up in the shadow of a deceased sibling. They grew up with a parent who was never able to be effectively present again after losing the one child. Christmas was never happy again. Birthdays were never happy again. Holidays were never happy again. Every major holiday, every day was just a reminder that my parents or my parent is still grieving this person that's lost, and they're not happy with me. I can't make them happy. I wish I could heal them, but I can't. They don't even, I wish that I was enough for them to enjoy life, but I'm not, because they're not enjoying life. They're never going to recover from this. That is, I, I'm not talking about myself, obviously. My siblings are all still alive. My parents are still alive. But I've known people who went through this, and it is psychologically scarring. Okay. Um, so, no, children do not replace children that you have lost, but life does go on, and we have a moral obligation to show up for it as life goes on. So when it says that the second half of Job's life was better than the first half, yeah, that's hard to hear for some people, but I'm going to say that it's possible, and it should not be insulting to the memory of the first half of life. I'm going to tell you a story about a couple that I used to know. They're both gone now, and they gave me permission to use this story. I used portions of it in preaching for many years. They were married for a long time, had a wonderful marriage. It was the second marriage for both of them, but they were not divorcees. She was a widow, he was a widower. Um, they both lost their spouses. They each lost their spouses when they were fairly young, in their 30s, and when their children were little. And it was an interesting scenario because it was two couples who were close because the wives were friends with each other. That was the connection point. The two women were close; they were best friends, and so the older of the two husbands got sick and died, and then she was alone with her two little kids, very angry at God. And then her best friend got sick and was going to die. So she had lost her husband. She was about to lose her best friend. And her best friend made a deathbed request of her. She said, after I die, I want you to marry my husband. And she said, I hate to tell you this in your deathbed, but I don't like your husband. I never have. And her response was, well, I didn't like him when I met him either, but if you give him a chance, I think he'll grow on you. And she said, all right, out of respect for you and our friendship, I promise you that I will give him a chance. And she said, that's all I can ask for. And then she died. She gave him a chance. And they had more than 30 years together before she died. And now he's gone. So their second marriages were longer than their first marriages. And they had the kind of marriage that everybody aspires to have. It was a wonderful marriage. They were funny with each other. They had a good time together. They loved each other's kids. And I asked them, I said, we talked about this. I was very young when I knew them, and I was learning a lot from them. They were parental figures to me. And they said that their second marriage was so different from their first marriage that there was no way to ask the question, which one is better than the other. They weren't directly comparable, and they didn't view the marriages as being in competition with each other. So would they have said the second half of their life was better than the first half of their life? I don't know that they'd have said that. They'd have said the second half was longer, and they'd have said the second half they'd have said that it was at least as good. And what I'm saying is, if God wants to bless you, do not let your grief get in the way of a new blessing. So what does this tell us about God? The main point of this on that end is that righteousness is not rewarded in this life. It might be practical in some cases, but it is not divinely rewarded in this life. Righteousness has to be its own reward. The joy of a job well done has to be the joy. Sandy, welcome. Sandy, if you had been on time, I would have thought something was wrong with you. I hope you're not offended by that. Love you, Sandy. Anyway, what does this tell us about ourselves? Well, it tells us that we need for the world to make sense. That is a need that is within us. Our brains, our problem-solving machines, really, they're narrative-building machines. We understand the world in stories, and stories have cause and effect. So we're always looking for the cause, and sometimes there is a cause, but it's not an intentional cause. So the world does not always make sense. Okay, and yes, Andy. Well, we've all got bad. Yeah, don't worry about it. My memory's shot. Swiss cheese. The world doesn't always make sense. Okay, and in the Bible, evil and chaos are very closely related concepts. Okay, evil by definition is the events that are not part of God's plan. So it is our natural instinct to ask, why did this happen? But often there is no answer to that question. Job does not get an answer to that question. There is no why. What does this tell us about our relationship with God and each other? Well, obviously, do not kick a horse when it's down. And by that, I mean, whatever we say to someone in a crisis, when someone is in crisis, whatever we say to them has to be about their needs. It cannot be motivated by our own discomfort with the situation. And sadly, many times the things that we say are really about us trying to make sense out of the situation, about us wanting to just resolve it and be done quickly, wrap it up with a pat answer or something, and not really speaking to what that person is feeling. So when in doubt, say nothing. Just be there. I mean, always say that I love you and I'm here and I'll help in any way that I can. But maybe stay away from the why answers, because we're not God. So tonight we're going to have a presidential debate. Yippee. I'm going to try and get out of here as quick as I can so I can go and see it. But I did want to say something real quick about our HARC meeting today, Hagerstown Area Religious Council. Today we heard speakers from the Refugee Welcoming Network, on something that I didn't know a whole lot about. It came into existence not too long before I came here. And the reason it came into existence was specifically to deal with Afghan refugees who fled Afghanistan after the disastrous United States withdrawal from Afghanistan. And in particular, the people who had worked with the United States government and had to get out if they wanted to survive. One of the speakers compared it with the fall of Saigon, and I understand why he compares it. It's the only other obvious event in U.S. history to compare it to. I'm going to say it's different, though, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But so the Refugee Welcoming Network has helped 18 Afghan families make themselves at home here in Washington County, mainly around the Hagerstown area. People from two of the families spoke very different stories, very, very moving stories. I don't have time to tell you tonight, but the thing that really touched my heart is that they said they love living here. That they said while they were en route here, they heard all kinds of stories about anti-immigration sentiment in America and how hard it is to get refugee status and how hard it would be to get in. And but there was no other place they wanted to be, and this is where they came. And they said they have not encountered any of the things that people warned them about. They said they've just had nothing but positive experiences since 2021 when they first started coming here. They feel very blessed by the community, and they hope to someday be successful enough here to give back to the community as good citizens. the thing that was the most touching was they said having refugee status does something to you psychologically, which I can understand. I mean, I can't relate to it. Obviously, I've never been a refugee, but I can understand why it would. There's the notion that you're being protected in a foreign land because you can't go home, and they said we don't want to be refugees. This is home now. We're never going back. We want to be. I'm wording in my own words, but they're basically saying we want to be Americans. We want to be viewed as Americans because we are now. We can't go back. We're here forever, and we don't want to be refugees here forever. We want to be one of you, which to me was just, oh. And you know, I knew somebody who had served in Afghanistan when everything happened, and I got to see it. I got to see the grief from that side of it as well. And here's why I think it's a little different from when Saigon fell, which obviously was before my memory. I was alive when Saigon fell, but I was, I think, 2, maybe 3. When Saigon fell, we did not treat the Vietnam veterans the way we should have treated them. We did not treat the Vietnamese refugees the way we should have treated them. And we haven't even told the story fairly or accurately. We don't tell our children the true cost of our withdrawal from Vietnam. Most kids today, if they've heard anything about Vietnam at all, they think that the war in Vietnam started when we invaded Vietnam and ended when we left Vietnam. They have no clue that the war had been going on for decades before we got there, have no clue that the war continued to rage afterwards. The difference was that after we left, people had no protection, and millions of people died. Not just violently, but for a lot of different reasons. A lot of people died directly or indirectly because we left the country when we did. Now, I don't think this is directly comparable. It's comparable in that we were involved in a foreign country between two power, trying to help one power resist the oppression of the other power. It's directly comparable there. It's comparable in that our withdrawal was disastrous for the people that we were trying to help. So in that respect, we didn't learn our lesson at all. But we did learn our lesson in that we treat veterans better now. And from what I was hearing today, we're treating refugees better now. We haven't learned enough from that experience, but we've learned something, and I think we're doing a little better. So, what are we going to talk about next week? I don't know. I forgot to take a look at next week. I am going to be out of town next week, but I am still, as of now, planning on doing a lesson from out of town. I'll be back in Lancaster again for the Financial Leadership Academy. I broadcast from there last time. I hope to again this time, but it kind of depends on whether or not I have time to put the lesson together while I'm out of town. All right, so let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer, shall we? God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking as Jesus did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. All right, folks. Thank you for joining tonight. Thank you for sticking with it. This was a long lesson. All right. I'll see you guys either